that time, when I was still living in New Mexico, I got the idea to write this book, which would be what my friend Christy calls a unique perspective of 200 years of American history, telling a collection of stories that would be our story. And when I got into Oregon and I was teaching a course in Native American history at Chemawa Indian School, I learned about the Peacemaker, and I thought, where best to start our story than with the story of the Peacemaker?
Your story begins and ends with the Peacemaker.
It does. It does.
Interesting that the story starts almost in the present,
yes.
Very near to the present on September 11th, 2001.
And that, I think, was the defining time in our country where the challenges that have been apparent in our country for 200 years, since the culture of the Peacemaker declined and we went into a supposed democracy, leaving out very important principles of the Peacemaker. And I think that the challenge of September 11th, 2001 is kind of what brought all of that to the forefront in the 21st century. And so I thought it was very timely to end the story there, but then to pick it up with a little epilogue at the end of the story.
Mm-hmm. The copy that you furnished me with to prepare for this interview has a part of the family tree for the spotted owl bear clan, but you've updated that for your revised edition.
I have. In fact, that was one of the motivations to come out with the second edition, was after I did my original release and got the book on the market and got lots of really good feedback from people, but people telling me that they struggled getting into the book with the genealogy and they needed something to bring that together. And then when I did my book tour back in October, through October and into December, back across the country, talking to libraries, independent bookstores, gatherings at the Friends Church, churches in certain areas, people read my book ahead of time, and then a lot of the questions that they had kind of told me when I came back that I needed to revise the book to make it into the book that I wanted to write. And part of that was to put the ancestor chart in there, which now is part of the second edition, and to pull out a few stories of characters that were not excess, because the people who read them really enjoyed having those stories, but really weren't that key to the message, and they did cloud up a little bit of the ancestry and the flow. And so I took some of those stories out. And then in the chapter on the Trail of Tears, rather than focusing on the defeat of the Seminole in Florida in the Everglades, I focused on developing a fictional story of what happened on the Trail of Tears to the Native Americans on their journey from Georgia into Oklahoma.
How do you achieve that delicate balance between history and fiction?
It is rather tricky, but the approach that I used was not that difficult, because I wanted to make this history that was lived by people. And so basically what I did was develop fictional characters around people in my own family tree, whose stories I took those stories. For instance, I had an ancestor in 1754 who fought in the Revolutionary War, and he was scalped, and he survived. And that character appears in the story. My family tree is filled with stories of the men in my family who served in the wars. And so my grandfather fought in World War I. He was gassed and died early because of that. So there's a character that I molded after him. I wanted to make it living history. And by doing that, I kind of took the stories that I knew from my past and created characters around them.
Were you tempted to rewrite history?
I was rewriting the history that I taught. I was. That was my intent.
Early in the book, you refer to the False Face Society.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
That was the society that took care of the healing practices in the cultures of the Iroquois Confederacy. When people were ill, when they would have rituals at times that were connected with the movement of the stars, the planets, their healing times, when they did a lot of their cleansing rites, took place during that time of hibernation in the winter, when the dancing stars disappeared, when the light disappeared and it was dark, and they brought the light into their homes through the light of the games and the celebrations and the things that they did to honor their ancestors and to honor their spirits. And the False Face Society was a big part of that. They would perform at these rituals with their masks and their rattles, and they would go from house to house and they would do cleansing rites. They would cleanse the home of all of the negativity that had surrounded them during the past year, during this time of cleansing and hibernation, and bring them forward so that when they moved into the time of planting and renewal, that they would be reborn, that they could get rid of the negative things that had happened to them in the past. And one of the characters in my story, the young girl who is raped, who turns away from this, and at this time the False Face Society had pretty much disappeared from that power and that part of the culture. And when she is raped and her mother tries to bring her into healing through getting her to go through the dream rites and to do these things, she refuses and says, "I have what I need," which is her choice to take alcohol as a soothing for this, which is not really a healing, it's just a distraction or something temporary.
We're talking a lot about the different family trees and the how the stories are being told through these times. Great quote in the Civil War era of the book, after Gettysburg, when Charity is speaking to James, who has survived the battle, and she says, "We are all part of the same family."
Yes, yes, and that was my bringing the families that had been torn apart on each side and bringing them together through the union of these two. And that was a very significant and important part of the story.
Is this a self-published book?
Yes, it is. It is it's available basically on the .com venues. It is a print-on-demand book, and it is available at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and I have my own website, www.kentuckywoman.net, and you can access it there.
We've talked about the title of the book and the idea of the Peacemaker. So where is the Peacemaker now?
The Peacemaker is still carrying the message through me going out and doing what I'm doing. To get the book out there, to get the message out there to people, to help people through telling these stories and opening up a dialogue about these stories that have been hidden, in many cases out of shame, out of the fact that if, for instance, in my own family tree, I have an ancestor that I am researching and hopefully will be writing my next book about, that was kind of part of the inspiration. She was, my grandmother was half Native American and half African American, but that was kept from me because at that time in our history, if the people who were from those cultures did not have any rights, they couldn't own anything, they couldn't do anything, and so the stories that I was primarily told were the stories from my English heritage. And so by getting these stories out and having people think, well, there's a big move for people to go back into their genealogy and to do their family trees. And more people are finding this out, especially in the eastern part of the United States, where there was, as I point out in my book, there was a lot more mingling of the cultures than people actually realized, because when these minority cultures were taken out of the history books, then those of us that were part of the mixed cultures kind of moved into the white society through the back door and never spoke about those things.
Did you know your grandmother that was not talked about?
She actually lived with us when and she died when I was 10, but she lived with us from the time I was 5 until I was 10, and there were very many issues with my grandmother. Lots of things that were not talked about. Lots of estrangement, especially from my mother's side of the family, which was primarily English all the way back.
In the future, do you see yourself writing some Oregon stories as well?
Well, if you when you get to the end of the book, you will find that I pick up the last 4 chapters of the book are set in Coos Bay, Oregon. So there is the history of the Coquille people, what happened to the Coquille people, and it ties in a little bit of how the Native American world got so pulled apart and is so intermingled with their heritage and not really connected all the way back to one true heritage themselves, that they have many mixed heritages. But basically, Clyde Bellincourt, who brought the nations together under the American Indian movement, his goal was to bring the nations together as a spiritual movement and a tie that all of the tribes are actually one. And in many ways, I look at Clyde Bellincourt as a peacemaker.
Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Okay, we got it.
Good.
I see it right there.
All right.